gentlemen, we're going to talk today about your process for first starting to talk about a design and then how you go from that first time someone phones you to where that design ends up on stage. And I think everybody would love to hear about your interaction with the artists that you work for. So what I'd love to ask is for each of you to tell one somewhat brief story about that process in a show that you've worked on. So we'll just head along the row. Jefferson, please go first.
Well, mine's a little bit unique because I've only worked for those two bands primarily. So they give me pretty much 100% creative control, maybe 99%. But as far as artist interaction, the time where it's, for me, most challenging, where I feel the obligation to really learn something from a operating standpoint, is when we do a cover, because I feel like if the band, Umphrey, McGee in particular, they cover the songs very accurately, note for note. So I feel that I should do that. And there was a time where they covered the Tool song 46 and 2, and I said, okay, well, I'll learn it, just I need to make sure I'm learning the right version. They said, album version, note for note. Okay, great. Tool isn't on any of the streaming platforms, or they weren't at the time. So I found something on YouTube. I learned it note for note. We go out in front of, for us, not for these guys, but for us, summer camp is one of our biggest shows of the year, and there's 10,000 people there or whatever. And I go and I totally blew the ending and botched it, and it was probably like one of the worst moments of my life where there's like that. You just feel like everyone in the entire world is looking at you, but they're not. And the reason is because it was a radio edit that I learned, and we all learned different versions. So that's the closest I have to a design story.
So I just want to ask you, when you say that they give you 99% control, does that mean that they really leave it to you to make the creative choices? Is there a place where you present them, or does that part really just happen in your own choices?
I meant within the song structure. There's been a couple times where our lead singer said, hey, could you do this one thing? And somebody else made a request, but over the course of 11 years, it's happened a handful of times. But I still need to present my design ideas to management for budget approval, but there's not much artist interaction on that end.
Copy that. Okay. Chris.
Hi. I come from a fine arts background, so I like to start very rudimentary. I'll cut pieces of paper out, straws, and place the design in a million different ways before I move to something more advanced like a CAD. A story that I can think about with the design aspect with an artist is I was working for a band, and you mentioned them, the Secret Machines, and a great three-piece psych rock band. And we had kind of run our time with each other, and everybody in the band had an opinion on what the light show should be. And I remember the drummer said to me, the next tour, we're gonna go out, I don't want any lights taller than me. He's 6'2", so start at 6'2", you go right down to the ground. My ego got the best of me, and I said, these guys, I don't even understand this, So I started shopping other gigs, and the Strokes came along, and I ended up with them, and I'm thinking, I have amazing creative freedom with these guys, because they were great right up until rehearsals. And as they said, they were going on stage to rehearse, I'm out there, and I'm still programming, getting the show up, and it was a canned show, meaning we didn't run it live. It was cue list after cue list, and so I'm thinking I have carte blanche. So the production manager says, hey, the band's gonna go on, so we're gonna start with this song. Okay, great. They go and start with that song. I look to the next to me, it's the lead singer, Julian Casablancas. He's now giving me lighting cues. And that's how it went from there out. And I really had a hard time giving up the creative control, but at the end of the day, they're the ones that sign the check. And it was a great learning experience because it took me out of my comfort zone and put me in a place that I would never travel to if I was on my own accord.
Could everyone hear me okay? Not used to talking into a microphone.
Get your face 3 inches from the mic.
3 inches, got it. Okay.
The sound guys will thank me.
Okay, so I'll tell a little story about how I became a Justin Bieber fan. So I was home on break from on my morning jacket tour in 2012, and it was September or so. And I was over at my old office, which was just a few blocks from here on North 11th Street, and I got an email from somebody named Richard Glasgow. Any show of hands, anyone know who Rich Glasgow is? Yeah, a lot of people know him. He's the tour manager, and I like to say road manager, and ostensibly father figure for the band known as Fish. And we've heard of that band, okay. Fish, with a PH. And he wanted to know what my availability might be to discuss potential upcoming design work with Trey Anastasio Band. And I thought to myself, Trey Anastasio, frontman for Fish. Fish has a lighting designer. Why are they contacting me? And that was the first response I had back to Richard. I said I'd love to chat, but first wanted to know why they weren't having discussions with Chris Kuroda, who's the longtime Fish lighting designer. And Richard explained to me that Chris had been hired to go design Justin Bieber. And that left an opening for a lighting designer for Trey. Thus my newfound fandom for Mr. Bieber. So within a couple of days, my associate and I took a meeting with Richard and Trey at a coffee shop on the Upper West Side. And do you know the coffee shop? Yes, you do. Seems to be a satellite office, but I didn't know this at the time. So as was the process in those days, my associate and I, we did a computer model of what we thought the stage plot looked like from doing a little bit of research. I think maybe we asked Richard for one. And that's usually a departure point for me, figure out, first, what's the layout of the band on stage? How do they like to present themselves? And so we printed those out on some 8.5 by 11 pages in RenderWorks sketch mode. So it looked kind of hand done. And we took a pile of those over to this coffee shop and an iPad full of like portfolio shots. And we sat down and sat in the coffee shop and started having a discussion. We ordered some coffee. We talked about some ideas. I showed through the different photos of other work that I had done, and to kind of gauge what Trey might be reacting to, responding to. And at this point, I didn't actually have the job, so it was still a little bit of a pitch work. After about 20, 30 minutes, we kind of felt like we were clicking. He was responding to some of the photos that had more textural work and contoured work, and Trey was trying to explain to me how this new record, Traveler, was playing out, and some of the music, and how he thought about some of it, and then he just kind of stopped and put his hands down. And he looked at Richard, and Richard looked back at him. There was a nod, and Trey said, "Let's go back to my place. It's right around the corner." And so Richard and Trey got up, as did Ben, my associate. They got up and walked out, left me with the bill, and which I paid, and then ran after them in the rain to catch up. And talked with Trey as we were walking about some different ideas. And by the time we got to his apartment, we sat down. We put the piece of paper down, the sketches. He showed me the album cover, which was kind of this Japanese-inspired artwork with intertwining blue waves. And so we just started kind of sketching out the idea of what a backdrop could look like, starting from a scenic place. And then within that, once we kind of worked out showed him some ideas for some waves, overlapping, intertwining, and then sort of showed how we might be able to contour some light that went with that. And he reacted to that pretty well. He played some music. We talked about some ideas. And 2.5 hours later, I walked out with a handshake and a lot of ideas, a lot of thoughts. And we went back to the office, found an image of the album artwork online, printed it out, and then took a scissor and started cutting out the waves until it really kind of laid out the way we wanted to. And the process from there, as I like to say, has it's full of things that are both revelatory and inspiring, and then the list of what I like to call and now what's? Which is where you come out with a design that is exactly what the artist has asked for, and then maybe even more so, and then discover that the budget's not there. Okay, so you start reworking that a little bit, reworking it. And then you get a little bit closer, and then you find out it all has to fit in a bus trailer. And so you rework it a little bit, you rework it a little bit, and then you find out that there's no budget for a technician, you gotta do it all yourself. And then you rework it a little bit and start to strategize in your mind how you're gonna get that changed before you go on the road. And ultimately we presented a number of different renderings, different ideas, to the point where it all clicked and we got it into production rehearsals. And then once we were in production rehearsals, we spent about 9 days going through every song that would possibly be on the list and programmed through it, refined it, really got it to a point where it felt right.
How many songs is that for a tab tour?
At the time, I think it was about 40 possible songs. That has now expanded to about 65 to 70 songs that are in the current version of the Might Be Played page. And it's during that time where I got to overcome at least one of those challenges of the can't have a tech, which is, I like to say, maybe if there's managers in the room, this isn't so great for me to reveal this strategy, but if you wait sometimes until the artist and people involved have seen the work being put forward and are attached to it in a way and really want it, that might be the time to say, okay, we do need a technician to tour with this if we want it to be like this. Otherwise, we have to start talking about cutting back. And that's often a way in which you can, make numbers work that didn't work before. Get 'em hooked.
By which you have jumped already to my next conversation, so we're going to come back
really?
around to it. No, it's good, actually, because I think that is always a challenge for design. You're balancing what you want to do creatively with what's possible realistically, and how everybody parses that, I think, is very interesting. But first, we're just going to go to Robert and then come back to that.
Hello. The creative process, particularly with the artist, varies wildly. I think within music, the bands that I work with give me a almost complete free range to do what we do. Sometimes we'll talk about structure, and by then like physical structure, like what is the shape and how do we build a rig. But as far as like music dynamics, they sort of let me do my thing and just play along and follow where we need to be. One story, sort of like a bit closer working with an artist, I was with Dave Chappelle at Radio City Music Hall, and it was a rather rapid build and design process. I got the call maybe 3 weeks before load-in, and load-in was the same day as our first show. So we, a few days later, I'm in a conference room at Radio City, and it's 40 plus people. There's phones with another 30 people somewhere else. And production manager from Live Nation just runs through all the checklists of, box office and tickets and timing and all these things. And then we get to, okay, so what's the show gonna look like? And he throws to me, and it's sort of this big black hole. Like we work in these, empty spaces that we fill with whatever our dreams sort of, as money allows, that we can fill it with. And so it was the first time I'd worked with him, and so I didn't know, I watched a lot of his prior work to get experience of like how does he present himself on stage. And then after 10 years of not being in the public eye, how did he want to reintroduce himself? And I sort of threw some really loose terms out there, creatively, not getting into sort of color or light or pattern and texture, but more, is this modern? Is this classic? Is it urban? Is it, what's the world that we're in? And he had a few very clear ideas that I thought were really impressive, that I enjoyed working with. One was he recognized that he is just one man in a very large room. Natively, it's a 100-foot proscenium. They cheat it to 80 feet. It's still just one guy in a microphone in an 80-foot wide stage. And how do you make that intimate while still being grand? And how do we take our eye and enjoy this largeness, but really focus on this one person on stage? And so he had a few clear intentions about his entrance and how to get himself. He particularly did not want to walk 40 feet in applause. And so, so I pitched a few different ways to sort of reveal him at center, and we ended up going with one of those. And then, but he gave me a lot of freedom within those parameters, right? He was very clear of what he thought theatrically would work from a stage movement, and then we put it together. And then about a little bit after lunch, he showed up after things were built, and I showed him what we had. This is kind of what we talked about, and he liked it, and it worked really well. And he and then went up and told some jokes.
How'd you do the reveal?
Oh, so the reveal was, so we did a kabuki drop, and we did a huge, so he always travels the DJ, and before he goes up, the DJ does this 10-minute hype set, and so there's a stick of truss hanging over the audience, and I punted a 10-minute light show of just, dynamically just going higher and higher and higher, and then right when I get the word that he's ready, and the DJ gets the word, we dip to black, and crowd goes even, dynamically. Darkness, I think, is really important. We forget, the lights need to turn off. That's a really important moment. And so we go to black, and then we reveal that there was a low backlight that casts a huge shadow of him smoking a cigarette. And so from darkness, we reveal him smoking a cigarette. Kabuki drops. He takes 5 steps forward, and he's down center, soaking up the peak of applause. And then, a big ballyhoo to keep the audience moving, and then we settle. It was important for him that the audience be lit, so he could see the reaction of the audience, and then we had ourselves a little show.
So it sounds like he was super aware of how his own performance worked, and also that you thought his choices were good ones for himself. Would you have done something really different without that conversation with him?
Well, so we got a chance to do it again 5 years later, and this time we used the stage elevators in the and so we filled a lot of smoke and haze in the elevator, and with this nice reveal as he would sort of just come up again, sort of smoking a cigarette and doing it, and presenting himself on stage, and that too it was another piece of drama. He definitely. He recognized it was amazing to hear his understanding of stagecraft, and as I've worked with a few other comedians, while they're really good at telling jokes, they understand that they're not just telling jokes. So I come from a background in theater, and whether you want to say all the world's a stage or even musical performance, concerts, rock and roll, it's a show. And I think bands that get that. And choose to tell a narrative story through their music, but also visually. Comedians, especially at that level, totally get that. It's not just even some comedians who present themselves in what we might say is unpolished or rough or loose. That is all very much on purpose with a whole lot of intent behind it.
I'm going to turn to Jefferson and Chris for a moment and ask you guys this question that came up a little bit when Marc was speaking, which is how you balance the creative idea you have in your head that you know is fantastic against the reality of the budget or the size of the venues of the tour, and just how you have those conversations with artist and management to get the best version of your creative idea realized. Jefferson, do you want to go first?
I mean, there's so many examples, so I'll just go with the most recent one I can think of. For bigger shows, we get a little bit of an increased budget, like New Year's or Halloween or summer camp. For New Year's this past year, I wanted to use circle trusses because I typically can't. Our truck isn't large enough to tour with them. They take a really long time to put up. They have to be absolutely perfect. I mean, I like everything to be perfect already, but with a circle, if it's an inch off, it doesn't line up and it's too long to explain. But do you guys agree that, if your straight truss is a little bit off, it sucks, but if your circle truss is off, it throws off the entire science of the way the pie works, and I'm not the guy to explain that, but I asked for 4 circle trusses, and the concept was, you think about someone as iconic as, I'm drawing a blank, David Brickman, right? Marc Brickman. Sorry, too many LD names. Marc Brickman, arguably one of the most influential LDs, especially for moving lights. And he has that classic look where every fixture on the circle truss is on David Gilmour. So I wanted to do that times 4 because we have 4 guys downstage. But we couldn't find or afford 4 circle trusses. It's just a busy time of year. So we had to settle on 3. And I'm trying to do the math of we have 4 guys evenly spaced. So we went with 1 big circle in the center and 2 small circles on the outside. And for the whole week, I'm just kind of looking at it being like, it's okay, it's not really what I designed. But then after the fact, you hear all the fans, they don't know what you designed. They're just looking at it. They don't even know how pi works, maybe. But they're reacting to something that looks out of the ordinary. And I guess at the end of the day, it looked cool. I just don't think I have the perspective to appreciate it because I knew what the original vision was.
I'm actually going to change the question for you a little bit based on that. So this is something that, when we were talking ahead of time, I thought was a really interesting issue that you raised. We all obviously care very much about stage design. It's what we do. And so clearly we think it's important to shows. But you raised the issue, is it a value add? Are there artists or performers where people come intentionally because of visuals? Are there performers where it sways opinion, it may get more people in the room? I just thought it was an interesting question, and I'd love to hear you talk about whether you think people come specifically for production for some shows.
That's a great question. I know. Absolutely, I feel that they do. Especially festivals. You get into the EDM market, it's lights and video and flash and trash. I'm not going to bash the music, but you need some cover. You can really take a good show and make the show great, and people do go home humming the lights. I know that's an old saying that doesn't happen, but a visual impactful show will sell the show. I firmly believe that.
And do you think that happens through word of mouth? Is there some artists where the expectation of the audience is already there, that's built in, that they will get a visual show? Or do you think fan conversation drives some of that?
I think it's both. And in the improv or jam band world, which a lot of us are from, it's all those bands have a light show. It's no one's going out there without a light show. So and some of those bands stand on a light show sometimes. When you're paying 200 shows a year and you're paying 4 hours a night, you probably want someone else to drive for a little bit. So, that's a real thing.
Can I just to work off of that? So I think that no amount of production, visuals, lighting, or augmentation is going to take a band or a performance that isn't there and get it there. So it has to start from the music, right? And the shows we go to experience. And perhaps there are some genres where, like EDM, for instance, where the visual really is built into the fan expectation. But I think as stage designers for live music, particularly bands that can play anytime, anywhere, our role is often to find ways to create an environment that's comfortable for a band to play in, create a visual space that can enhance the performance, that can enhance the audience's experience. We find ways to create heightened experiences that the band itself is already opening up. So, an audience comes to see a show, the first thing they're coming for is they want to see and experience their favorite artist. And, it may be the case that, that artist that people have grown accustomed to seeing, in a dark space with, some incredible visual enhancements that go along with it. Perhaps they're playing an outdoor afternoon set where, where our powers of lighting are rendered useless. And, though that could create either interesting challenges for us if we're operating shows, or might be very frustrating for us if we're operating shows. I don't think necessarily that the audience's experience is diminished. I think that they're just having a different experience. And I've spoken many times with some of the artists I work with after a daylight show, and sometimes you'll hear them say that they really enjoyed being able to just play it out and not think about the production elements. And then I've also heard the same artists say that they're ready to go back to the dark where they could hide behind the smoke and turn around and, like Chris said, let someone else take the driver's seat for a minute.
And
You don't use
obviously,
smoke during the day?
I think that does vary somewhat specific to the artist, specific to genre, and that leads me to another thing I'd like to ask you guys. Many of you work with jam bands or bands who play improvisationally every night, where you're going to be making your visual choices on the fly in the moment. And many of you also, or either, do work for artists where the performance is somewhat more structured. Even if it's not absolutely locked every night, there's specific order or consistency to some parts of the show or much of the show. And I'm curious, when you, in the very initial part of your design, when you're working out your budget, working with the artist, figuring out what your gear is, do you think there's some fundamental differences in that process for an improvisational show compared to a structured show? Anybody? Robert?
Yeah, well, I think it's about creating a flexibility, right? Having a rig that can do things that even when you design the rig, you didn't know it was going to do, right? And so for better or worse, I often am only with a rig for a day. Touring with the Roots, it's a lot of fly dates to music festivals, and so I'm a guest LD on someone else's rig, and so it's how do I make this rig go to 10, right? The band's gonna hit 10, and we're gonna what is that moment, and then scale it back from there. Okay, so most of the show is in that 6 to 8 range, and then I'm gonna find that dark moment that's at 2 or 4. And play those dynamics. And so when building a rig, I want something that is as flexible as possible, and then within a certain style, right? So a band that large, we have 10 people on stage. For me, the show is very much them, right? The show, while there's an element that is a beam show, and there's an element of flash that comes with sort of that particular heavy sort of hip-hop moments, but it's really about making this team, this band, shine. And it's as flexible as we can make it, and the console is just all in the control, right? How much time? It's all triage. We show up, how many fires can I put out, pick and choose, and then less is more. I'd rather things be executed properly and cleanly than trying to be super flashy. Because again, it's about the music, right? Like the daytime shows can be just as successful as the nighttime shows as long as it feels good. I think our job is to make it feel good. The lighting on some level should fall away. A lot of my work, it's not about the lighting. It's a show, and the show really starts from the music.
For me, it's the downstage light a lot, because, and again, I go back to Brickman. When I saw David Gilmour 3 times in a week, because I'd missed him my whole life, one of the things I noticed is that, for what I do, I only have downstage light. And Brickman was lighting Gilmour from a different angle for different effects, very much in a theater style. So, there might be one song in the middle of the set that's very slow and dramatic, and there's just one light above them. But we do a different set list every night, so it's not practical for me to have one light up there just in case they play one out of 250 songs. So my rig, kind of what you were saying, it has to be versatile. And sometimes I wish I had that one light for that one dramatic song, but they might play that song once a year, and I can't just go around hanging stuff on a whim. So I think the bands that stick to somewhat of the same set list every night, that's the trade-off. People always say oh, do you think it would be fun if you worked for a band that was the same every night? And I say, no, I think I might get bored, but that's the trade-off, is that you get to hand-pick exactly what you want because these are the 20 songs, or 99% of the time those are going to be the songs.
An opportunity to craft those moments more specifically.
Right.
Yeah, I'd mentioned canned before, and that's a term in our industry, is when you actually cue out the song. And with the Strokes, I had that opportunity, but it becomes very stale and very boring. It doesn't leave for a lot of happy mistakes, as I was called that. And happy mistakes, as I found, is new frontiers. So with Dedico, I mean, we have 130 songs and counting. It's I don't have that much time in my life to cue them all out. But I've gotten to a point where I have a hybrid system where I have what I would call the greatest hits, or the songs that I know they're going to play in the dark in the second set, 20 or 30 songs. And I've basically come up with tricks that I would use in each one of those songs. And I try not to look at the set list too closely before the show. I try to go up there in the moment. And I mean, my songs are laid out, but I don't think about where I'm going. And I find that it leads to opening more doors than happy mistakes.
Okay, gentlemen, before we go to questions, I'm going to ask a question that has occurred to me in the process of our talking, but we didn't speak about before. As you guys have described your work with artists, you've talked about it in a couple really different ways. Some of you have said, this is great, I got complete creative control. In other words, as I'm interpreting it, not a lot of specific input from the artist, and basically left to realize your own vision for what the visuals should be. And then some of you have described really great, what sound like great collaborations, where you have exchanged back and forth with the artist about their ideas. When talking about it, you guys sounded joyful about the different versions of it, and so I'm just curious about that. Maybe that's a personal preference about how to work, but maybe each of you could talk about where you find the most joy in that between freedom and exchange. And we'll kind of keep this one really brief, guys, so we can do questions.
I would say for me, it's both, all, and everything in between. In the sense that, when you have an artist who comes in, like, for instance, the Sufjan Stevens Carrie and Lowell tour, Sufjan has some very specific visions for what he wants to express and how he wants to express it. But then within that, he also has a lot of areas of the design that he leaves open. So finding those places to help build structures that he is perhaps not seeking in order to help support the visions that he is desperately seeking is very, very rewarding to be able to put those things together in a way where, it really does feel like a true collaboration. Whereas, there are some other artists who, their sole directive is show me something cool, or wow me, or I don't really know what I want, but I'll know when I see it, which is a little bit of a double-edged sword because you may or may not ever get there. But, I think that, there's a, and I don't, we wouldn't even have enough time to touch on all of this today, but, that lighting, production, set design for live anything it's not a pure art form in the sense that you don't get to take your own canvas, paint it however you want, and put it on a wall. And you've by becoming a professional in the field and embracing it and staying with it, committing to it, you've also committed to, I don't want to call it compromise, but I'll say it's compromise. You've committed to a certain version of a compromise art form right from the beginning, and by being able to open that process to others and have others, like the artists you're working with, open their process to you, you really find something that's, I think, is elevated beyond what you would get if you were just doing it alone.
Does anyone else want to address that briefly?
Well, I mean, both, right? Like, it's the creative freedom to do what you want, what feels good, and when a musician puts their trust in you that you're just going to feel this out and it's going to feel good and that works, like, that feels great. But I think it's also, I didn't write the song, right? So, like, there was an initial creative moment that this musician had. They recorded this. It means something to them. They are trying to project a story or an idea, an emotion to an audience, and me as a listener, I pick up something, it may not be what they intended. It could be what they intended. We can have a creative conversation of what did this song mean to you? What is it you're trying to tell the world in this song, and how can we represent that visually? And sometimes that's about color or texture or composition. And then the dynamics find themselves. I think that's sort of the root of it. Going back to sort of like jazz improv of just like where are we in music. But that's different than is this story about a particular person or a particular event or and is there a visual story to tell with that, or no? Is it just like no, just make it look cool and we're happy. Just keep the lights dancing. And there's a moment for both, I think.
Okay. 2 minutes, so I think one person can answer this. One thing that was interesting to me looking at the incredible resumes of everyone on the panel is that all of you do really amazing live concert work, but every single one of you does work in another genre. TV, theater, architectural installation. So I'm interested in how video editing and producing, I'm interested in both how those things inform each other. Does that other work change how you look at your concert work? But also, super briefly, do you think that that's just a change in how our business works, that there's a reason that all of you would do that now?
I mean, for me, it was pretty mind-blowing. Like, it's still mind-blowing to me because my background is in broadcast journalism, and I was a video editor in high school and in college. And then because laptops weren't really to the point where they could edit video yet, I didn't edit any video for 10 or 15 years. And I went off and had a career as a lighting designer, but I still missed video editing, my first creative passion, or one of them. And when I came back to it, I thought, I'm gonna really be rusty. And I was better because I had learned music from one of the most technically proficient bands. And so by knowing how to count time signatures and knowing the difference between when it looks appropriate to fade to black versus like a hard cut, that was all just based on, 10,000 hours of watching the drummer hit the last note of the show. So for me, I don't know a lot of other editors who are also lighting designers, but it's a really interesting phenomenon to me.
Did you want to go?
Oh, okay. Well, my day job, as I call it, is I sell and I rent lights, and then at night I flash them, which gives me a bit of a negotiating angle. Just last night, I was dealing with a vendor on the West Coast, and they were going back and forth on my list, and they're saying, well, we don't want to send you the price. I said, why do you want to send me the price? I sent you the list, just give me the price of what that is. Well, it might be too much than what you're looking for. I said, listen, I'm going to say that this rig is between $24,000 and $26,000 minus tax, and he emailed me back, he's like, yeah, it's $25,500. So that gives me advantage of negotiating and knowing what the worth is that's going out there, and also knowing when people are trying to get too much money for something that's just not worth it. Your gear is only good if it's out there making money. So, it's an advantage, I believe.
I think that specifically, I'm sorry. Okay, specifically light is such it's an abstract medium, and we take it for granted almost all the time in our life. But take it off the stage for a moment, and you're outside. I mean, observing natural light and going, it could be anything from the biggest, brightest, sunniest day, and you see light through the trees, and you're transformed by that, or perhaps there's walking through a city street, and there's a crack of light through a few buildings that happens to illuminate some just random incident that has all this power of a specific moment, and when you're thinking about the different genres between concert work, TV work, theater work, I think that there's, I try to remember and remind myself that in the excitement of a rock concert, there are these solitary theatrical moments of a single light having more power than 1,000 lights. And perhaps in a certain moment of a theatrical piece, there's a moment where having an over-illumination can be more powerful than anything else. So trying to sort of take your experience of light in the real world and bring it to all of the different ways in which you can create on a stage or for a camera, ultimately all the processes inform each other.
And very quickly, I'll just say I enjoy storytelling, and I think that story can be told the way we entertain ourselves is not just through musical performance, although I very much enjoy doing music, but whether that's at a restaurant or in various other hospitality or theater. I mean, I was trained in theater and opera, and I think there are many different ways to tell a story, and even theatrically, it's not always in front of a proscenium. And so, as a designer, I think it's fascinating to break away from just lighting backline and people, and instead, lighting tables, lighting an environment that we get to experience, where the audience physically walks through, a lot of proscenium show or even music festivals, the audience just staring at a stage far away, and I think there's some really refreshing working in environments where our audience is in and amongst our design, and whether that's in a theatrical experience that, like a Sleep No More, or like things that are, more experiential, or going out for dinner, or walking Disney World, or just being in an environment that is artificial, but to your point is like taking the the beauty and magic of the real world, and how do we reproduce that with purpose, and telling a story and guiding people on a journey.
Can I quote? I'm just going to do a quick quote, okay? Everyone here, a lot of people here might know this. You'll know this, but it's once in a while you get shown the light in the strangest of places if you look at it right.
Okay, we would love to take some questions now.
Thanks so much. This is probably mostly for Jefferson, because he's the one I'm most familiar with lighting design, and he's been lighting Umphrey's for so long that he's completely in sync. And my opinion is that that process of becoming in sync creates a whole different relationship of the fan to the concert experience. And my question is, how often do you find yourself shifting the way the band is interacting? And is there, do you feel that having a full access to the lights with the music, especially on the webcast, gives a more richer experience to the fan?
I want to make sure I'm answering the question you asked. Can you just repeat the question?
How often do you see the band potentially shifting based on the way that you're interacting with the lights?
Right, that's a tricky question. That's one of those things that you don't ever really want to admit publicly, because they're the artist. Come on.
Nobody's watching.
But I will say that sometimes they will say to me after the show, "Oh, I really noticed the lights," or I had a different band that I don't do too many one-offs, but I've worked with a few bands, and I won't say who this band is, but, well, I guess you could look it up, but they said, we got lost a couple times tonight, and the lights were our, unifying. This is a band that doesn't play that often. They don't do 100 shows a year, so they were a little bit rusty, and I wasn't, because I do 100 shows a year, lighting improv, and there was a couple times where they were just way out there, and I was just like, this is easy. I'm, hitting the one, and they told me after the fact that they'd been watching it, kind of like the way you would watch a conductor. But the only times that I notice it, and this might have more to do with just the way my brain works, but I notice it when I make a mistake. If Jake is soloing, our lead guitarist, and I think he's going to go to the big release, or I think he's going to play an arpeggiated, run of notes, I'll either do, the big white release or a bunch of strobes, and if I'm wrong, he'll sometimes, have my back, and you can tell on the one he wasn't going to go to the big hit, but then he sees me do it, and he's like, oh, I got you, man, and then, it's so subtle. It's like half of a beat.
Lucky.
Yeah, I don't know. Does Mickey do that? Or?
Oh, no. They don't even know I'm there.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. And I love the fish anecdote. Yes, clap it up. The fish anecdote, I met my husband at the Baker's Dozen tour 2 years ago. So didn't want to clap for that, but thank you. So question, because we've talked so much about the lights, but I'd like for you to speak to kind of the other elements that you find on a stage, whether it be a visual, like a video, or, like Cherry Glazer has a big-ass inflatable cherry on there, that they light up. I would love for you to speak to how you kind of play with those elements and any challenges or fun stories to share.
I could say, and I think we've probably all experienced this as lighting designers, particularly in the concert field, that oftentimes you're brought in on a project and there is no set designer and there is no video designer, there is no one designing the gags. And what happens is as the sole person kind of responsible for visual, you start to just kind of take these things over. And so I'll just throw another quick anecdote to that. So for a number of years I worked with Matisyahu, and this was, he used to do, I think he still does shows that he calls the Festival of Lights during Hanukkah, and specifically he used to do 8 nights around New York City. It started with the Hammerstein Ballroom, and then he split it into like half Webster and I think half Music Hall of Williamsburg. And there was one summer, we were supporting 311, which gave us a lot of time off, after that show. And Modest and I were having a conversation about how we can elevate the Festival of Light shows. And we were talking about different, rock moments that have moved us both over time. And to harken back to a Mark Brickman reference, there's, of course, the ubiquitous Mirror Ball from Pink Floyd, which we spoke about at length, and he said, well, how, what could we do? How big of a mirror ball could we get? And I said, well, it's the Festival of Lights, so it's Hanukkah. Why don't we make a mirror dreidel? And it was kind of like, that's kind of a good idea. What do you think? One of those. And then he kind of, did the same back. That's a great idea. And on that summer night was born the idea of the disco dreidel, which became a gag that he's used every year since, I think, 2008 or 2009.
We used it here.
Still used
It was used here. There you go. So it's, I guess, sometimes some of those, a lot of the work we do, I think, is about creating moments, in addition to sort of these overall kind of ethereal vibes that we're talking about. There's these moments throughout that are going to be the takeaways that the concert goer, the audience, you never know who's going to walk out of the show, even a show that you consider to be a throwaway. That person could be the one who looks up and has an absolute life-changing moment that they'll always speak of. And it could be, any number of things, from a disco dreidel to an inflatable pig to, whatever else.
I think the other thing that drives economics, and in the architectural world, there's this term of value engineering, which we do in the concert world, but I don't think we'd put that sort of fancy term on it. Lights are cheap to rent. Video walls have become cheaper to rent. Scenery is incredibly expensive to build. And so you need an artist that is willing to spend more dollars. And there are artists who believe in it and will happily build a custom set and then the manpower to bus and truck it around the world. But they're far and few between. And so I think we sort of rely on lighting because it is the cheapest tool we have that we can be most effectual with. A set will always be that set. A wall will always be the wall. A moving light can be lots of different colors. It can have lots of different intensities. It can move. It can be static, and it can move quickly. It can move slowly. The dynamic range of a moving light is way more dynamic than a piece of scenery is. That being said, I think a piece of scenery used properly, whether it's a mirror ball shaped like a dreidel, it can be highly have a big impact, and highly effectual, and be the moment that everyone goes home and remembers. And often, that one big set piece comes out in the last song, whether it's like some big reveal or some big moment, and that's a way to use those dollars well. But often we're just always fighting budgets of well, they can't afford this, so we'll just stick with the lights.
Yep.
I think we probably have time for one more. Maybe two, if they're fast.
Well, I thought I would go around and maybe each could tell. It's so interesting to hear the stories of one story of working with talent that relates to what you did that stands out for you in some ways.
I'm sorry to say I don't think we're going to have time to round robin that.
Well,
But we'll tell you over lunch, Pete.
I think we can go a touch long. But that's the benefit of being my conference. Sorry, Shemetz. It's okay, you didn't see him, it's dark. But it is, that's the most fascinating part of this stuff, I think, is the stories. Why don't you I'd love to hear each of you tell a story that sticks with you, that maybe was gonna be a challenge moment, and you'd have to give them pretty quickly. We can't go too far over, but you can tell it. What
Ooh,
stays
the time
with
went
you?
up. 2 minutes each. Go.
Well, for me, I mean, it was working with Chris Carota down in Mexico. I believe it was the first year that Fish did their Mexican event, and I was the site lighting designer. So my job was basically to make sure that the LDs, and Chris knows this very well because he was down there with Dead & Co. Our job is basically to say, this is our plot for our site lighting. Anything we can do to help you, just let us know. So Chris, as we all know, he's one of the best, and he's also a perfectionist, like probably most of us. And so we were talking over the course of the week, and basically he came to the conclusion he didn't have enough hands, so I'm just going to put up a static look and leave it per song. I said, okay, just to do that was a huge honor, because this is probably my biggest influences. So, okay, I'm going to hit a button, I'm going to put up the look number 1, and for the whole song, it's just going to sit there, right? And he goes, yep. And then in my head, I don't know where I got the balls to ask this question, but I said, what if they play 2001? What do you envision then? And, what's that? Strobe it. So he said, well, for 2001, yeah, maybe a little bit of movement. And that was like all I needed to hear. And then what about Antelope? And so over the course of the week, it kind of evolved to like, you can do this, but it's got to be very subdued. And there was 3 shows. The first show, there was a lot of back and forth. Too busy, you're too busy, you got to slow down, too much. And then it was, if I go to a hot color, you got to go to a hot color. And it's like, well, how do I know if you're going to go to a hot color or not? And then by the second night, something just clicked. And I think it was because the night before, somebody had explained it to me. They said, you've been playing lead guitar your whole life, and now you have to play rhythm guitar. And that was it. That was my moment.
One of the most interesting things that ever happened with me with an artist, I was working for an artist called Common in the hip-hop scene, and I was new to the scene. I didn't really know that there was a thing called hip-hop lighting, because there wasn't. He decided to put me on stage just like the DJ. And that was an experience that I'll never forget, because you've got that whole other perspective, plus you can't see what you're doing. It was a learning experience.
Oh boy, didn't I already tell one? I think I told 2. Anyway, I'll do. There's a quick one, and it's really all about. It also incorporates what to do when you're given certain constraints on your design and how to sort of embrace it. And this goes back a few years to working with the Replacements when they did their last reunion tour, and they said from the start that they didn't want any color. They wanted only white light in the show, and they didn't want any movement. They wanted it to feel old school, just like it would have been in the 80s, which is subjective, but we can kind of interpret that as lighting designers. So I thought that through quite a bit, and I came up with a design that had no moving lights and about 300 par cans, most of which I got from BML, because it was the only place you can get that many par cans from.
Still got them.
And still is. And I did manage to convince them that white light itself is a subjective term, and I broke the lighting system up into all sorts of shades of white that went from the upper parts of the blue spectrum and daylight and all the way down to the warmest kind of tungsten lights like we have here. After the first show, they agreed that I had both stayed within the confines of a white light show, but also managed to create incredible dynamic, as far as it can go, yeah.
So working with the Roots, we were sort of known as everybody's backing band, and anyone can show up on any given notice, and while often there's at least a little bit of a heads up, and sometimes that's 30 seconds before an artist walks on stage, we were doing the Roots Picnic here in New York a few years ago, and one of our headlining guest artists was late. significantly so. And we were already on stage performing, and Questlove, musical genius, it's an honor to work with him, and he very quickly changes on the fly as needed. And so we plugged 20 minutes of music waiting for this guest to show up, and it's just going to play along. It's like he calls a song, and on the one, we're in it. And then he called a few more because we just had to keep covering time and time and time. And we've done that a few times. But that was, to me, that one was like, oh, it's a hometown show. Often, there's sort of the luxury of like traveling the world, and it's not as glorious as it sounds, and it actually be quite lonely. And when I live here in New York, and to do a hometown show, like friends are there and families there, and umpteen thousand strangers, and then we just get to, okay, we're going to do this song, right? And it's sort of that having that flexibility and sort of having a little bit ready to go in the gate and ride the wave.
Okay,
Abigail,
I'm going
we
to
wanna
tell
hear
one
you too.
myself. I worked with Roger Waters on one of his solo tours and on his version of The Wall that was in Berlin. And that show took place really close to summer solstice, which meant that where you are in Berlin, it's just not dark for very long. So for an outdoor show, we would be trying to catch every minute of daylight, and we'd be sitting, we just spent a long time sitting by ourselves in this field that had been part of no man's land between East and West Germany, and that had very recently been an area that you could get to at all, and it still wasn't really public. And every now and then, the band were rehearsing somewhere else, and every now and then, at 3 or 4 in the morning, Roger would appear. He would appear. And he had a security guy with him who I had toured with before, and so the security guy would always walk across the stage, which was to give me a hint that Roger was like looking at what we were doing from somewhere in the field, which was very nice of him, yes, so we're not caught unaware. And then Roger would like appear in front of us. And that was a massive, massive site. It was a really huge space. And one night when he came by to look at what we were doing, he said, I'm watching you play stuff back, and I'm realizing that this space is so huge that you can't possibly physically be in time for all of where the audience is watching. Sound and light travel at different speeds, and we're in a space so big that that it's not going to look lined up from everywhere. And he said, to me it looks like you're a little early, but I will just say that the VIP section is right over there, and my wife is going to be sitting there, and I would suggest that you try to be in time for someone looking from that spot. I hope you guys will give a really huge thanks to our panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail.